Cupcake's Rage. Words and art by N.S. Tesser. The butterfly named Cupcake lived in the great white nothingness, a place that exists mostly as an idea, but somehow still manages to fit civilizations into it. Cupcake's house floated in the nothing that made up most of the reality, which was both solid and empty simultaneously, allowing people, animals, and things in general to move freely through it, but also build structures on it as though there was land. Other than the odd structure built here and there was just more nothing, stretching out beyond where the eye could see, in just a vague white glow that somehow illuminated the things that were there. For the most part, Cupcake enjoyed his life. His house, a little square thing that looked like something a child would draw when asked what a house looked like, with the triangular roof and haphazard paint job in primary colors, contained very little. One corner had a bit of tree trunk that was somehow kept alive despite not having any source of water or sunlight, but such was the nature of the great white nothingness. It had a handful of flowers, which Cupcake could drink nectar from as he stared across at the other corner of the house. It contained the large television screen made entirely out of roughly baked clay, which had worked for the first 10 minutes he lived in the house before a rogue piece of logical reality floated through, bringing with it the knowledge that electronic devices need circuits and electricity to work. Luckily, that was the only damage it did, as most of the rest of Cupcake's existence was teetering right on the edge of possibility, if not well beyond it. Besides, Cupcake somehow enjoyed complaining about his television not working more than he enjoyed watching it, an activity he engaged in at length with any traveler who had the misfortune of floating near his home. After what could have been days or could have been millennia, since time is more of a suggestion than an absolute in the great white nothingness, a traveler made the mistake of installing circuitry, or perhaps merely made popping noises with his mouth as he pretended to solder things together. It could really go either way, and the television started working regardless. Unfortunately, that made Cupcake much angrier than the television being broken ever had, so he let out a scream fueled by the souls of countless generations of butterflies that had been murdered and put on display by human serial killers, or lepidopterists as they prefer to be called. The scream summoned an army of semi-sentient flowers of various types, walking on feet made of roots and carrying weapons in their leaves, though most were common daisies. A few tulips and several orchids were scattered across the army, and at least a dozen sunflowers towered over the psychotic garden. An elite unit of roses with hardened stems and sharpened thorns guarded Cupcake as he led his cute but deadly forces through the great white nothingness, burning everything that crossed their paths. First, they came across the land of the golems, which proved no match for the flower army. In most realities, golems are clay people brought to life with magic words of one sort or another, but in this realm of half-formed ideas and insanity, they were the result of a Roman hippie fallen in a tar pit and a stash of hallucinogens being absorbed into the tar, creating little pockets of consciousness that formed sticky bodies and crawled out of the tar, building a civilization whose chief function was staring at random objects and seeing windows into other realities open up and wave at them. As such, only a handful of golems even noticed the flower army surrounding them, and by the time they noticed the flamethrowers cradled in the leaves of the carnations, it was too late. The flowers laughed as the flames leapt from the nozzles of their weapons, igniting the tar bodies of the golems. The fire spread quickly, and soon the entire city was burning. Cupcake watched with a fire of equal intensity burning in his eyes before picking a random direction to take his army next. The flowers burned a twisting path through the great white nothingness, taking no prisoners and leaving no structures standing. The roly-poly mountain was destroyed after a battalion of chrysanthemums with C4 strapped to their stems charged into the tunnels, spreading throughout the entire mountain before all setting themselves off at once, killing most of the odd round inhabitants while the rest of the army picked off the few who managed to roll out of the mountain before it exploded. Each settlement they found, no matter how big or small, faced similar fates until suddenly, out of the west, which was especially impressive since cardinal directions don't actually exist in the Great White Nothingness, came Bob, head of maintenance, and his army of weed killer. Cupcake's army of flowers fought valiantly, but were no match for the mechanically powered spray bottles filled with plant killing chemicals. Wave after wave of flowers shriveled and died as they threw themselves against Bob's forces. Only the Rose Commandos managed to avoid that fate, climbing up the stems of the sunflowers, even as the poison soaked into the roots of the giants, and leaping off their heads to soar over the weed killers, attacking Bob directly. Bob wielded a pair of pruning shears with the skill of a man who had spent years working as a combat gardener when he wasn't keeping the loose threads of his reality from pulling apart and taking everything else with them. The roses came at him with all their skill and might, but he dodged each of the strikes, sometimes letting thorns come within millimeters of cutting him as he struck back, lopping off petals, taking chunks out of stems, and cutting into their flower heads until all that remained was a pile of sap-splattered bits that used to be elite flower commandos. Having dealt with the flowers, Bob swapped his shears for a net and swiftly captured Cupcake. He took the angry butterfly back to his house, smashed the television with a hammer, then locked the door and put bubble wrap around the entire house. Each bubble in the wrap contained a tiny spider to ensure that should Cupcake or anyone else attempt to free the butterfly, it would go very poorly. With that, the Great White Nothingness was once again safe from the crazed butterfly, and Bob faded back into the maintenance tunnels to keep working behind the scenes until the next time his services were required. The